Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for Teledyne ISCO's September Chromatography webinar. This month's webinar is focused on Analytical to Prep, our focused gradient generator and how to use it. Today's webinar is being led by Jack Silver, one of Teledyne ISCO's applications chemists. If you have any questions or concerns or comments throughout the webinar, please utilize the chat function within the Zoom platform and all questions will be answered at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on Teledyne ISCO's YouTube channel later on next week. And at this time, I will turn it over to Jack.
Hello, everyone. Good day. I hope all is well with all of you. Tori indicated that we'll be talking about our focused gradient generator, but I'm going to be talking about a variety of focused gradient generators and some of their advantages and disadvantages. So our agenda is what is the problem? And then we're going to talk about different techniques. We're going to talk about the time on target algorithm, which is a slightly different approach to the issue. And then we're going to talk about factors that affect all gradient calculators and what to do about them. And so these issues apply to any of the focused gradient generators. So the problem is someone synthesizes a compound, or they took a crude extract and they ran it on a silica column if you're working in natural products. They see the peak elute, and the question is how to develop a good method. Please note this peak on the analytical run over here that comes out in about 7 minutes. And with that, it doesn't show up. It doesn't come out at 100% B, obviously. So the question is, when does it come out? And you can see from the prep run, it really comes out at about 85% B solvent rather than 100%. For preparative gradients, our needs are, we want an efficient purification. That is, we want the compound pure. The method needs to be easy to develop, and part of an efficient purification means that we use the minimum amount of solvent needed. We want the method development to take very little time and solvent, and preferably working to an existing workflow. All of the methods that we will discuss require matching analytical and preparative columns, and if you think about it, it makes sense. C18 comes in a number of different sub-chemistries, if you want to phrase it. There's C18AQ, you have C18 that might be bonded, say, to a polymer, and that's going to run a bit differently than a simple end cap C18. And so if the compound elutes a little bit differently with the different C18s, going from an analytical to prep won't work very well. You're going to have selectivity differences. As an example, running a Phenomenex analytical in the Waters prep column won't work very well. One method that I very commonly see when I visit customers is this zone method. And the zone is very simple to use. It's actually very common. And the problem is that it's very fast to use as an end user, because you run your scouting gradient and the compound comes out at different places. And the question is you have to set up these different zones ahead of time. So over here, we have a peak that comes out at about 6 minutes, and that's going to come out towards the end of the zone. Over here, we have a peak that comes out at about 10 minutes. And if you apply the zone to that, it's going to come out a bit early. It's not optimized for any particular compound. You need to determine the zones for your different columns when you buy them and set them up. And the ionizable compounds that might elute at the beginning or end of a zone might not elute the way you hope they will, and we will discuss it a bit later. However, this method is something that I see in a number of labs, and it's easily implemented. And the reference for this is listed at the bottom right of the page here. Another common technique that I have seen in customer labs is something called accelerated retention windows. What you do is you run several compounds on an analytical scouting run. Then you run a scouting run on the preparative column with the same compounds, and that allows you to adjust the behavior between the analytical and the prep column. You then run a quick run to calculate the draw volume on your preparative system. And then you have to determine the elution for calculating the percent B or solvent from the graph over here. And what you see is that it comes out as a straight line. And so you can correlate very quickly the solvent composition required to elute the compound to the retention time that you see on your analytical column down here. Again, I list the pertinent references down here at the bottom, so one can look that up. Journal of Combinatorial Chemistry, Yan and Blom. There is one more step that needs to be done, though. You can use an analytical run to determine it, and what we're doing is we're looking at how much the gradient is delayed and how much is it delayed. So a very simple method that people can use is just simply add up the draw volume and the column volume. The draw volume is the volume going from the pump or the pump mixer to the top of the column, and it would include any loops that might be in the flow path. And the column volume is simply the space inside the column that is not filled by the stationary phase. It's essentially the void volume. If we do this very simple calculation, we find out that the peak comes out pretty early. And if we go back over here, we're interested in the second peak over here. The second peak comes out, you can see a little bit of separation, but not very much. So that means that the solvent is still too strong. So we need an additional delay in the gradient, as shown by this blue line over here. And it's described as a correction factor. For the accelerated retention window, they apply a delta to it. And they have to determine this correction factor by trial and error. So that's kind of a disadvantage, is you have to go and do the calibration and then do one more calibration to make the compound elute where you want and get the separation that you need. So when you add in this mixing volume or delta or correction, you now see that you have a nice resolution of your second compound compared to everything else. You get greatly improved retention. You get useful chromatography. So what's the problem with that? It works. Well, the problem is that this mixing volume didn't apply across all chromatography systems. So in this case, I used a flash C18. If I were to apply to a different preparative HPLC, I would have to determine the mixing volume or the delta or whatever you want to call it again. The other thing is how to determine this mixing volume. The other techniques that I mentioned, other than the zone method, you need to measure the analytical column volume and the analytical draw volume in order to calculate the gradient delay on your analytical system. And then you have to set the desired retention time for the compound. So you have to do an awful lot of work just to get to the point of being able to do a first run. Using the time on target algorithm, we calibrate the analytical scout gradient. And the first thing we do is we run a test compound and adjust the gradient condition so that the compound elutes at the time that you want. In this case over here, I want my compound to elute at 6 minutes. So I just simply run it isocratically and tweak it until I get the elution time that I want, or at least very close to it. Okay, that actually doesn't take very long, just a couple of runs. The next step is using an analytical column with a matching chemistry. You run the scouting gradient that you're going to use with the same compound and the solvent system as the prep system. And that's shown in the bottom image over here. And from that, we can see that the compound elutes at a certain time, as shown over here. And what we do is we simply say that this compound elutes at 50% B, no matter what the program gradient is on the analytical system. So we can then calculate an effective gradient delay or an apparent gradient delay. And this has been presented over here, and I've run it with peptides and any number of compounds. There's a couple of other minor things. You measured the draw volume and column volume, and because we are running a small gradient on it, this correction does help improve the calculation a little bit. On something like an AccuPrep where the draw volume is very small, you could almost ignore that. And depending on the flow rate that you use, sometimes you could even ignore the prep column volume because that can sometimes be small compared to how it affects the gradient. So as an example, we took dimethyl yellow, note the purification time. Using the delay noted from the calibration, I determined the sample, and I find out that it elutes at about 88% methanol, as shown over here. And so you can use a spreadsheet to do this calculation, and it works for C18 and PrEP. In the September issue of ACS Combinatorial Science, we do have a description of this that has been published. So flash chromatography, it works well. I did the calibration here. Use the solvent composition to calculate the analytical gradient. We manufacture flash C18 columns. We also have analytical and UHPLC columns that match our C18 used for the flash column. And as you can see, I can then calculate a very nice gradient for the HPLC for the flash system over here, and it works rather well. Using the focus gradient generator on the AccuPrep, I can then do the same thing. It's built into the system, and this is the same compound run on a UHPLC. We run a very fast scouting run. You touch the peak to be purified, and you get an efficient focus gradient. And it's much easier on the AccuPrep because we simplified the algorithm, and we have a lot of parameters built in already. So what you do is you set up a column method, and that's part of installing a column. On the AccuPrep, you tell it what size column that you have, and it then calculates a flow rate that you can change. And using those parameters, you can then set up a scouting run. The initial percent B are usually 5, 10, or 0% B. I usually use a focus range of plus or minus 5%, which is very nearly isocratic. There is the option of using a 20% range that many people use for the zone or other gradient methods that I described earlier. However, 5% works very well, and we've not had too many problems. We haven't had any problems with that. And the system defines the rest of the parameters based on the column size and flow rate that you use. After you do that, your focus gradient generator is ready to use. There's no further calibrations needed because we've done them all already. And it doesn't matter which C18 column you use, either ours or someone else's. So you select the column and you select the scouting method. 150 millimeter long column will have a 6-minute gradient, and other columns will have a gradient in proportion to that. And we have a 4.6 millimeter column that runs very well with a virtual small loop, and it runs at 1 mil a minute, and we can use very little sample and very little solvent to run the column. So you run your scouting run and you get a chromatogram. Pressing the focus button over here opens another window that lets you choose a column that you want to use. And then you select a matching column for the purification, and then you then select the peak. And in this case over here, this little peak over here is the desired compound. You hit the focus button over here. It will then generate a flat focus gradient centered upon the elution for the desired peak. The compound typically elutes in 5 to 8 minutes, and using such a flat focus gradient improves the resolution and the loading. For natural products, again, it works very well. This is a crude natural product extract that came off of a silica column. And using the mass spectrometer with the scouting run, I can then see the mass of my compound over here. And One Touch generated a gradient method, and it eluted very nicely with the impurities. There aren't many of them at the baseline over here. It actually works very well on silica gel too, without any further calibration. We have a universal test mix that we use. This was run on silica prep, hexane ethyl acetate. I focused on the second peak over here, and I then ran it, and I got some very nice and acceptable results off of that. The other thing to note is if you can see a peak during the scouting run, we will resolve it during the prep run over here. In this case, there's a little peak that's showing up as a small shoulder over here. And when we calculate the focus gradient, we have it baseline resolved. Another example comes from a customer. The sample was purified on another system, and it was cleared as pure. And you see over here that there's just one peak showing up over here. When we ran the scouting gradient, we see that there's actually 2 compounds over here, and they're very different compounds. The UV is different between them, and it came out rather nicely over here. I will explain shortly why the peak is not centered over here, and the peak shape actually gives a bit of a clue about what's going on. However, the compound did elute on the focus gradient, and we were able to resolve a hidden peak from the desired compound. So it's very greatly simplified. We set the prep retention time 6 minutes. We assign the column flow rate or use the flow rate that you enter. We measured all of the volumes to tune the focus gradient, so we know the draw volume. We calculate the column volume. We set the parameters for the scouting run since we already calibrated the gradient slope and flow rate, and we can scale to different column sizes. So we've run this with a 5 centimeter column and have gotten good results. Calculated gradients, whether it's the time on target algorithm or any of the other algorithms, have some limitations. You need matching columns, and that includes if one column is worn out, the retention time is going to be different on that column because it's really not quite the same column. For example, on C18, based on silica, sometimes the C18 gets worn away, and so you have a column that's partly silica gel, partly C18. The column isn't exactly matching the analytical or prep, depending on which column is worn out. compounds that elute very early are going to be hard to calculate a gradient for, and I'll tell you how to deal with that. Compound chemistry, in particular ionizable compounds, behave a little funny, and we'll talk about that. And if you overload your column, that's going to affect your retention as well. And also, if you dissolve your sample in your strong B solvent, some people do that, it can affect the chromatography. And also, dissolving your sample in DMSO, too much DMSO can affect the chromatography as well. So a compound elutes very early. You notice that we have this analytical delay down here, this apparent analytical delay. A compound that elutes over here is going to elute with a different calculated gradient than expected. The problem is that all of us who calculate these gradients assume that the compound doesn't move until the gradient gets to a particular point, and then it starts moving at once, and we all know that's not true. A compound that elutes someplace over here is actually moving down the column. So what happens is we see the compound come out at some point, we calculate a gradient, and the compound usually comes out later than we expect. The way to deal with that is to make a scouting gradient, make a gradient from the scouting run initial point. So in other words, if you start off at 5% B, that's what you start your scouting run at, and then you try to end at about 20% higher than that data point. So a 5 to 25% gradient, and it should elute within that period. The zone method, they deal with that by just setting a defined zone over there that's different from the other ones. Another thing is to try an AQ type column. You can run that at 0% B, so it gives you a little chance of starting at a lower percent B and actually can give you better resolution. So in this case over here, I have a column, a regular C18 column, and C18AQ runs are at the bottom over here. It could not calculate a gradient with either column. However, you notice that the C18AQ column does show a little bit more retention than the regular C18. That's because I was able to start at a lower percent B, start at 0% B, because the AQ columns are resistant to phase collapse. And so I was able to get just a little bit more retention there. One question is, what do you do if you have several compounds that you're interested in? This happens commonly with natural products. Sometimes you might have a compound and you might want the starting material if you're doing synthesis work. The gradient is nearly isocratic, so how far apart can these compounds be? And also, where should I touch the screen to get them to run? So we have a scouting run using the time on target algorithm as implemented in PeakTrack. And I've determined that a range for the gradient is about 22% B. And using our default gradient, it's about 1.4 minutes separation between compounds, and we can run them on the same focused gradient. So purification of several compounds at once. If I go back to the top slide over here, to the previous slide over here, if I touched halfway between the peaks over here in the middle, what I'm going to get is this chromatography over here on the top run. The second peak just elutes past the end of the gradient. However, if I touch, going back over here, about 3/4 of the way between the peaks, in other words, don't touch straight in the middle, but touch 3/4 of the way through, what I find is that I can then get both peaks centered on the focus gradient, and I can get a nice run out of that. One thing that throws off any gradient calculation with perhaps the exception of the linear solvent model, which is described by Snyder and Kirkland. Ionizable compounds can run poorly in focus gradient, and we can make the compounds run properly with the modifiers, and we'll show you that. The problem is that the compounds are in equilibration. Acidic compounds are in some sort of equilibration between the free acid and its conjugate base. Likewise, bases, usually amines, are also in equilibrium with a more polar form. These more polar forms, they retain less on C18 and elute down the column faster, so it causes a fairly broad peak. So as an example here, we have quinine, which is an alkaloid. The top runs are the scouting gradients, and then the bottom are the focus gradient. So over here, the compound elutes fairly late, and you notice that we calculate a gradient based on that, but the compound elutes at or very near the void volume for the column. In this case, no solvent modifier was used at all. In the second one over here, we ran 0.1% formic acid. So quinine is an alkaloid, which means it's basic. It's sitting in formic acid, so it elutes a bit earlier on the scouting run as you'd expect because it's more polar. And that's reflected in the focus gradient being a much lower B solvent. And you see now we get a nice gradient and we get resolution from an impurity over here. Okay, the compound comes out just a little bit late and the peak shape is a little bit tailing here. We'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. Another example over here is salicylic acid. Again, the top runs are the scouting runs. The left is no solvent modifier, and look at the peak shape over here. You see that it's fronting over here, and that's what you see in the focus gradient, which at least worked this time. In the second run over here, we ran 0.1% formic acid, and you notice that the main peak doesn't change very much with respect to the focused gradient, and the calculated focus gradient is actually pretty similar to the one run without the modifier, but the peak shape is greatly improved. So as you can see, the scouting peak shape often gives a clue that the prep run may or may not work very well. Again, the compound elutes at about 7 minutes on the focus gradient, and you might recall I mentioned the zone method and how that might have a problem with ionizable compounds. If a compound elutes very late off of in the zone, it's going to elute very late off of the focus gradient that the zone method will suggest that you use. And therefore, if it's eluting late off of the gradient over here, you might not see it during the focus gradient run off of a zone calculation. Over here, we try to optimize the gradient for every compound. So if it elutes a little bit late, it doesn't really matter very much because you still get your compound purified. It still runs on the gradient. So why do they elute at other than 6 minutes? It seems that there's, as you might say, not enough modifier. Very common is the use of 0.1% modifier. So that's 0.1% TFA, 0.1% formic acid, or 0.1% acetic acid. However, for a prep run, I'm running about 50 to 100 milligrams of quinine, which is 4 to 8 millimolar in the band. That's 4 to 8 millimolar of the compound within this peak over here during the preparative run. So the concentration of the compound I'm trying to purify is very close to and even can exceed the modifier concentration. The other problem is TFA, formic acid, or acetic acid are not buffers. They're just an acid. You keep the pH low. 0.1% is better than nothing. It does do a great job at improving the peak shape so we can get usable chromatography. However, because the concentration of the compound is similar to that of the solvent modifier, it's still in equilibration. So over here, we have a run with 0.1% acetic acid over here. I then ran quinine with 100 millimolar ammonium acetate, and you see that it eluted a little bit later than with 0.1% acetic acid. I then calculate a focus gradient and run it with 100 millimolar ammonium acetate, and now you see that the compound does elute at 6 minutes, so it elutes at the calculated time. There's very, very little peak tailing as compared to the run earlier. So this is suggestive that the compound, some of the issues with calculated focus gradients is simply a matter of kinetics with a ionizable compound and the solvent modifier. We have a compound that's a bit more difficult to purify over here. We have bromocuracil purple. Not only does it change its polarity, but it changes its structure such that this very, very polar sulfonic acid becomes a relatively very nonpolar sulfone ring over here. And we found that we could not use 0.1% acid to purify this compound. We still had bad peak shape. It would not run on the gradient, so we needed 50 molar sodium phosphate buffered to pH 2 to run it. While the peak shape is not beautiful, at least it's coming out in the focus gradient, and we are resolving the compound from the impurities over here. And this is a for real customer example. I'm not quite sure why they needed to purify the pH indicator, but they needed to, and they had a lot of trouble doing it, and we were able to purify it with the AccuPrep with the focus gradient generator. One thing to keep in mind is we needed to use methanol here due to the buffer instead of acetonitrile. The other thing to note is this is sodium phosphate, and you can use it on our system, but it causes the pump seals to wear out a little bit earlier because as it's pumping, the solvent evaporates off of the piston when it's outside of the pump, and you get some microcrystals that cause the seals to wear a bit faster. There's some accessories that make the focus gradient generator more efficient. These include the auto sampler, so you can inject very large and small columns easily. A column switcher lets you run a 4.6 millimeter column and then scale up and save more sample. There's no reason why you can't run a scouting run and a prep run on the same preparative column, but the small column just saves solvent. Of course, the 4.6 millimeter column, the mass spectrometer allows you to verify which compound you want during the scouting run. For those of you that have seen our AccuPrep in the past, we have some new hardware options. We run 150 mils a minute, wide auto sampler with more fractions. You can mix large and small sample racks and vials. Funnel racks, if you have a very large amount of sample to purify, and instead of purifying it into the test tubes or bottles, you could set up a funnel rack, and we can do sample overlays so that the same peaks go into the same container. Solvent modifier pump, waste select valve, so that if you have several different samples in the queue with the auto sampler, you don't mix up your waste with everyone else's just in case you have something of interest. We have reference chromatogram. I just mentioned the fraction overlays earlier. Those are used with time windows. We can run 6 mass traces. We can run a 4.6 millimeter column and have it run very well because we remove the sample loop during the run. You can also do an automatic no injection run with an auto sampler. That means that you can flush out a column in between runs or at the end of the day, so you can flush out any buffers or modifiers and help the column last longer. We just talked about the focus gradient generator, which is a new method of calculating focus gradients from analytical runs. And with that, that's my presentation, and I thank you for your time. And now we can take questions.
Sure. Okay, so we have had one question come in so far. If you do have any questions, please utilize either the chat function or the Q&A function within Zoom. The first question is, I have a next gen is the only possible. Is this only possible in prep scale Combi Flash, or can I have it install this in the Combi Flash I have? So they have the next gen, and I wonder if this is possible.
The answer is it is not possible at this time. If you want to run a C18 analytical, we have matching C18 columns, and if you get in touch with me or your sales rep, we can work out how to run these experiments to go from your analytical HPLC to your preparative system for C18. Is the focus gradient generator on the Combi Flash RF? That's an older system, and the Combi Flash RF won't have this built into it. However, again, we can work off the spreadsheet and from an analytical HPLC, as I just discussed.
I'll give it a few more seconds to see if any other questions come in. While we wait, Jack and the team are always available for questions. If you think of something after the webinar ends, feel free to send us an email or contact us through our website. And lastly, just a reminder that this is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel early on next week is when that'll get uploaded. So be on the lookout for that. You should receive an email when it is available for viewing.
Is this only applicable for reverse phase is the next question. For the flash systems, unfortunately, yes. There's some reasons for that with respect to the way the silica runs between normal phase and reverse phase. However, on the Prep LC system, on the AccuPrep, we have run it with normal phase with silica gel, and it works surprisingly well with the same calibration that we use for reverse phase.
Okay. Well, great. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. And I want to thank Jack for working through this presentation. It had a lot of great information that we shared. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Jackie, thank you very much for your time, and hope you have a great day.